Welcome to the latest episode of the Nevin Economic Research Institute discussion series. We're today around week 6 of the coronavirus lockdown, somewhere around there. Um, we're coming from you this week from Dublin Central and from, where are you, Cabinteely?
Cabinteely,
And
yeah.
Cabinteely this week. And we're talking about housing. Paul Goldrick-Kelly has written on housing affordability and on the cost rental model as a solution to the Irish housing crisis for the institute. So obviously we know that everybody's aware that the dysfunction in the housing market before the coronavirus hit. The price of a new home in Dublin, on average, almost doubled between 2012 and 2019. This is obviously a generational issue. The new requirements of 3.5 times your gross income, the maximum mortgage somebody can get, means that an average house in Dublin is actually um, just on pure income grounds is only possible for people at the very top of the distribution. Um, and home ownership, sorry, is down from about 80% to about two-thirds in the space of 2 decades. And rents have risen up 25% over the peak in 2008. So these are all issues combined that kind of tie lower income and especially younger Irish people into what many consider an unfair relationship with landlords, stuck in rental accommodation at extremely high prices and unable to save for a deposit. So obviously we've had a massive rise in unemployment. We'll see how long that lasts. I think it's going to be a little bit longer than some of the forecasts that we've gotten this week, but
Hmm.
we've over 1 million people on some kind of social welfare support, 800,000 or so on unemployment benefit, and this is disproportionately affecting young people. Already, we can see with the first release of data that it's disproportionately young people under 25 and under 35 who've lost employment. So, Paul, what are the immediate issues thrown up um, with the coronavirus as regards to the Irish housing market?
Hmm. So, as you've said, Ciarán, it's the crisis is hitting and interacting with a situation of dysfunction in the housing market anyway. So, the at least so to kind of lay it out in terms of the immediate pinch points, it's become clear to us, as other people have highlighted, that the issue of sort of adequate distancing and adequate housing it isn't just an equity issue; it's a public health issue. So first of all, good work from Social Justice Ireland. They've pointed out that many of those people on the availing of emergency housing through the department, traveller accommodation, many people, about 6% of the social housing waiting list, are there because they're in overcrowded housing situation. People in direct provision and people in domestic violence shelters. All of those people are sharing accommodation, very close quarters, sharing kitchen facilities, and it's actually they're in a situation where it'll be very difficult, if not impossible, to adequately socially distance and halt the spread of this disease. So that's a kind of immediate issue thrown up. The government has now, to be fair to them, acted on the real kind of pinch point before the crisis was the issue of the private rental sector, and the government acted quickly, fairly quickly, to put a moratoria on evictions and on rent increases for 3 months. I think following the end of March was when that was instituted. Um, but you are getting a surge in calls. Threshold have the housing charity, they've reported a surge in calls from people who are uncertain, asking what will happen after this 3 month period ends. People in licensee arrangements, so people renting a room from a landlord. Now, the evictions measures apparently apply to them, but they don't have the same kind of rights under the Rental Tenancies Board. So there's a lot of kind of uncertainty there, particularly about what happens afterwards. As you point out, people in the private rental sector tend to be in the sort of jobs that took the biggest hit here. And
Accommodation and food, retail, childcare, these are generally workers who wouldn't be in a financial position to buy a house
of course,
on average. So they're disproportionately in the rental sector. I think we can assume. I'm
of
sure
course,
there's
yeah.
some figures
As
for
that
that somewhere.
stat you mentioned for a new house, the implied income for that household is about 100K, and according to distributional data from the last census, that's 85% of the population wouldn't qualify
Wouldn't be
for a
able to
loan
buy
for
a
a new
house
house
in an average priced house in Dublin. At least,
in Dublin, a new private house.
obviously we'll see what the effect of this coronavirus is on prices.
Of
But
course, yeah. So that there's going to be kind of the longer term effects and watching this shake out. But in any case, so those people in the private rental sector, they're the people who've taken a real economic hit here. And there's sort of, I mean, over the course of this, there's been some advice that perhaps landlords might come to some arrangement with tenants, but they could well accumulate debt or go into substantial arrears here, particularly kind of after this initial 3 month period. And we don't know when the economy will really kind of jump start again. And indeed, this could actually be something of an impediment. If people arise from the crisis with a great deal of debt, they might have to pay down that debt rather than go out and spend, and that purchasing power might be affected. So that's, I guess, a bit of the shorter term picture. Like they point out a task that a fifth of tenants in the private rental sector were already finding it difficult to service the debt they had. So that kind of points to potentially a worrying picture if there isn't policy to address it.
okay, and so right, longer term implications. We're talking about, and I mentioned in a blog there, and it seems to be doing the rounds. Is it calls for a new social contract. Okay,
Mm,
the this generation of renters that we're talking about now, it's a generational issue. They have been stuck in this situation where their wealth, in a way, their future wealth is being extracted from them because of the fact that they're not in a financial position to buy a house, right? We don't like there's
mm.
often this idea Irish people are mad about houses or mad about property, but you'd
Yeah,
actually be mad not to want to buy a house if you were in the financial position to do so, right? So I'm in that
yeah,
situation
indeed.
myself now. I'm house hunting. The mortgage is going to be similar to the rent, and we're going to have three times as much space. Basically, is what we're looking at. So it's
Yeah,
that's again the interaction between rent and home ownership, and it's not that we're mad. It's just that's the least worst option. I certainly
yeah, yeah.
don't want to own a house, but it's just so much more appealing, just with the dynamics of the Irish housing market for me to buy a house, and
Mm,
everybody's the same. So this is a generational issue. Precarious work is up, wages are down,
mm.
and Sinn Féin did really well last month, and nobody saw it coming. And it's because the voices, for me, it's because the voices of that generation don't get their fair shake in Irish political
Yeah.
discourse. They're ignored. They're often, mocked even for saying, "Here, why can't we own a house? Why
Yeah.
is that naive to think that that's a policy goal of the politicians that we elect, So everybody's surprised by Sinn
Mm.
Féin, everybody was surprised by Corbyn, everybody's surprised by Sanders, and I think it's this general disconnect. So that whole generation are locked out and feel I think a lot of them feel exploited, having their wealth and their future extracted through rents, and they would get out of that if they could, but wages and conditions are down such that they
Mm,
can't. But they're not. That's 12 years of that since 2008. We're talking
yeah.
these new everybody from the Financial Times, all across the board. David McWilliams talking about a new social contract, talking about social democracy after this. I think there's going to be a push to go back to normal. I think that's going to be resisted. I
Yeah.
think it's going to take much longer than anybody's saying right now. And I don't think most people under 40 want to go back to normal. And if they are still in a precarious position in terms of their housing in a year's time and unemployed and whatever disruption is going to happen in the housing market in terms of homelessness, etc., I think there's a and with nobody able to go and emigrate to Australia, America, I think there's going to be a lot of anger and desire for change.
Mm.
So, like, what are the long term implications? I mean, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael are trying to form a government now. Um, they're not, the housing document doesn't seem to recognise, or the housing document isn't informed by this idea that we need a new social contract, it seems. So what do you think
Mm.
the long term implications are for the housing market? What's first of all, what do you think they're going to do, and second of all, what should they do?
Yeah. Well, you. I mean, in terms of what they've announced and that draft agreement, it looks like they're gesturing towards that a bit, which I mean is a change. But the issue would be, are we going to go back to the system? I mean, you highlighted it there. There isn't really an Irish gene for owning your house, or it's not some folk story about what happened in the famine. It was the result of active government policy to encourage home ownership. As social housing was withdrawn from the market and was only available to a smaller and smaller section of the population, basically the state intervened to try and get that person who might not be able to afford a house otherwise to own one. But that's come apart, as you mentioned there. It now actually we're above, or we're below rather, EU averages in terms of home ownership, which would be a surprise, and it happened pretty rapidly, leading up to the last crisis, and has been sped during the recovery from 2008 up to now. But yeah, so there's a danger, like the current response generally has been, we'll use public funds to chase the private market. The private market's going to provide our solutions for us. Where people can't afford in the private market, the state will step in, will give you a bit of a cash transfer to sort of top you up to make that affordable. The issue is that where you have a crisis of supply, putting cash in somebody's hand isn't really going to deal with that fundamental issue. So really, I think in the long term, the direction we have to go into is a much bigger role for public housing in the system. And that isn't, I mean, you look around the rest of Europe, and that's a pretty normal thing to have. Um, Having a big social housing option through things like cost rental, we brought that up in the introduction. It sort of balances the entire rental market.
So
And I think it could be particularly beneficial now, or after lockdown shuts, or the lockdown sort of ends, and we're looking to reboot the economy. Because right now we're looking to sort of freeze things and give cash to people who need it to make sure that demand doesn't fall through. But when we kick things back into gear, we don't want to repeat what happened in 2008 with the construction sector. We don't want to lose that capacity, those skills. We don't want to have that emigration of those workers that we need. So it seems like an ideal time for the state to step in, to start meeting housing need, rebalance the market, and keep those skills and that capacity so that we don't do lasting economic damage from this.
you mentioned two things there: rebalancing the housing market and you mentioned skills. So, like, I've had this, I have this theory anyway that um, we've had way less, something like a tenth of the amount of apprentice
Yeah.
stonemasons or whatever last year. It's not an option for young people like it was, and I think that's the rational reaction to the economy we have, right? So
Yeah.
I mean, this is another thing where policymakers try to put this kind of mass hysteria on Irish people, and one of the lines recently is like, "Oh, everybody's being sent to college. Too many people are sent to college, and it's not good for them. They don't need to." And some people it's ill-suited. But you look at the financial crisis, you look at the implosion in construction, you see that all the statistics, all the evidence shows that third level education is what saved people from the worst of the financial crisis. And they see a dysfunctional housing sector, which it could go down, it could go up, and you're talking
Yeah.
about intervention through social housing. Now, the more social housing you build, the less financialized um, the market is, and probably the less the less drastic the up and downs of house prices are going to
Mm.
be. So those two things are linked, but I can't see there's not um, no 16-year-old wants to take an apprenticeship if they suspect that in 10 years' time they're going to have to emigrate to Australia or be unemployed. And
Yeah.
so I think there's two issues there. For to address the skills shortage, we have to fix the dysfunction in that sector.
Yeah, I mean that sounds very plausible to me. You can sort of zoom out and see that as part of that overall new social compact picture. We shouldn't have these kinds of situations where people who are workers in all but name are self-employed, and that's done to avoid, the kind of the employer's contributions to the social insurance system. Because we should know that Ireland isn't really, or at least before this crash occurred, in terms of tax and revenues, the big thing that explains the difference between us and the typical Western European country is the absence of those kind of social insurance payments. And that sort of, and essentially mainly from the employer side. And I mean, a lot of the measures we've instated now, in terms of income protections when you lose your job, etc. Now they're happening at scale given the hit, but on the rest of the continent, that's sort of expected for workers. For many of them, they'll be guaranteed a certain portion of their income when they lose a job. So it's a much safer place to be, and it's a much safer situation in terms of riding out these hits. But yeah, like there's a good deal of evidence. I know there's a paper. I think it was Michelle Norris at UCD. She pointed out, looking at the Austrian housing system versus Ireland, that there's a relationship between the sort of the ups and downs. Like we call it pro-cyclical social housing policy. So you'll build lots of social housing when you have money, but when you go back into fiscal retrenchment, it dries up, and it tends to just sort of exacerbate market dynamics. Where in Austria, where they have a large social housing system, they could sort of ride out those differences, and it sort of pulled the economy back down and the rest of the market back down in terms of not sort of wildly
Yeah, there's a
fluctuating.
downward pressure on prices. They're not rising by 10% a year like they do in Ireland, and a thing that we seem to all celebrate.
They call it a unitary market, really. So the idea being that if you have a viable social housing option, for example, like we mentioned cost rentals, so that's where a housing body levies rents based on the costs of providing the house. Pretty simple: financing, construction of the house, etc., maintenance, and that's available to a wide swathe of the population. That's an attractive option. So the rest of the market has to respond. People go between um, will go between the private rental sector or home ownership or the social housing sector, but they're all viable options and they all have to compete with one another. keeping kind of prices down.
So, like rent and fixing the rental market, or at least tackling the rental market, can be a huge part of this as well. I mean, making it more attractive relative to home ownership, and changing the power dynamic between landlords and renters.
Well, that's it. I mean, and the rest, I know you know a bit about this, Ciarán, in terms of like Germany, kind of what you expect in terms of tenant protections in Germany. You have things like unlimited leases. If they're going to terminate a lease due to the sale of a house, that can only be done under very specific conditions. I mean, NESC pointed this out in their report, but we have very weak tenant protections by European standards. We're a lot more like the UK in that respect. But as you say, it makes it a marginal system, and it doesn't make it an attractive long-term option. To really kind of balance things out, we should have different options on the table.
And Fianna Gael, Fianna Fáil, they mentioned building housing, and they gave a number of their target, but did they, is there anything on the cards for that, like making renting more attractive and safe?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of their document, there's a bit on kind of housing and right to housing, etc. I'm not sure that there's that much in terms of the specifics.
No.
Now,
I saw that Social Justice Ireland, reaction to the document and on housing, and they have a podcast there as well with Eamon and Sean Healy, which was very good and a good reaction. So recommend that to anybody who's willing to listen. Okay, so the answer is we've no idea what's going to happen. We're still every week we're getting new numbers for another, like this week was an extra 50,000 people on unemployment in a week. So yeah, was obviously this is unfolding, but at the same time, there's certain things that are gonna have to be done for younger people, I think, and especially renters. And this, a ban on evictions will end in a month or two. There's going to be a lot of people unemployed of that generation and scared for the future. And this time round, there's no going to London, there's no going to Vancouver, there's no going to Sydney. So we'll see. I feel like the paradigm's already shifted, and that I mean there can't be anything but more social democracy after this. If well, it's an extremely uncertain future if the social contract isn't reimagined. Anyway, all right, Paul. Thanks a million for your time. Anyway, and and follow us on Twitter. We're at www.nerinstitute.net, NER Institute. And yeah, tune in next time. Thanks a million.